Sherry, from Leipoldt's Cellar and Kitchen, by C Louis Leipoldt. First published in Die Huisgenoot on the 29th of May, 1942. It is customary, justifiably in my view, to have something to drink before dinner. Our forefathers have done so from time immemorial. A pimpeltjie of wine before the meal was the expression in the old days, when that seaman's term still had currency. Today, nobody knows what a pimpeltjie is. But when I was young, the old ayers in the cool shade of the vegetable market, that used to be one of the sights of Cape Town, used that term for what we would now call a pirntjievol, a saucerful. They also spoke of a pimpeltjie when referring to a small bunch of something. But originally, a pimpeltjie was a measure of wine, a small glass taken before the meal. From a health point of view, there is something to be said for having a sip of wine before the main meal of the day. It is not just that alcohol stimulates the stomach to produce its digestive juices, but probably also the way in which the amino acids and oils in the wine enable you, 20 minutes later, to appreciate good food better. The question then is not whether to drink, but what to drink. Definitely not those heavy mixtures of fortified wines, liqueurs, gins, Canadian grain spirits, English beer brandies, or even Russian vodkas, and absolutely not one of the 103 variations of the American cocktail. They spoil your sense of taste and ruin your appetite. The only possible exception, but I would question even that, is the mixture consisting of 1/3 lime juice and 2/3 first-class balls. No, the very best drink before dinner is a small glass of genuine sherry. It contains everything you need for the preparatory stimulation of the stomach lining, and too little alcohol to have a damaging effect on the appetite. Sherry, that's the best pre-prandial drink. But what exactly is a sherry? I would be the last to defend, or even justify, the ridiculous fashion of giving the family names of established European wines to our Cape varieties. I shudder when I hear of a Cape Hock or a South African Burgundy. But with sherry, it is different. Originally, in the distant past, it was a wine made exclusively in and around Jerez de la Frontera in the south of Spain by pressing red and white grapes with a wheelbarrow full of gypsum and making from that a very light wine that could survive transportation, exposure to air, and climatic change. It was then a very cheap wine and not at all fashionable. The English soldiers in Wellington's army adopted it as their daily drink and took a taste for it back to England, where it had, however, already been known since the time of Shakespeare, with the result that it became fashionable, especially in the western part of the country. English wine lords then bought up vineyards in the south of Spain and spent a lot of money improving the wine. Experts established that sherry was the only wine to undergo a double fermentation, but with the passage of time, all sorts of superstitions arose about it. One of these was that it becomes much softer and better when sent on a journey around the world. Heaven alone knows why. This legend of overwhelmingly delicious quality of sherry that had circumnavigated the globe was undermined by one of the Walters. He bound a keg of sherry to one of his travelling printing presses, letting it turn and shake about for 18 months, and found that there was no noticeable difference between it and one that had been spared all the motion. Nevertheless, the fashion of sending shipments on a world trip gave us here in South Africa, or rather our forefathers, for we do not get it anymore, the opportunity of drinking first-class sherries. The sherry of 1882 was especially famous. After the harvest of 1870, it was perhaps the best wine on the market, and the rye, or second-class version thereof, could cost up to £200 a barrel. For one or other reason, a shipment was sold here, and some of it was still to be found at the old Pools Hotel, and, strangely enough, also at a well-known boarding house in Three Anchor Bay. Today, sherry is a made wine, in the sense that it is not a pure harvest wine. It also differs in the way it is produced. When the grapes have been pressed and the first fermentation taken place, the must is ignited with a special germ, the so-called sherry floor, that induces a second fermentation. This causes just about all the alcohol to disappear from the wine, leaving it with more amino acids and oil-rich substances, and all this is due to a highly complicated chemical process about which the cognoscenti can tell us very little. It is, in fact, because this second fermentation is so complex and mysterious that no one can tell in advance what the outcome will be. It may be an almost clear, quite bitter, very dry wine. It may be darker, richer, oilier, or it may be highly aromatic but very bitter. All three must first be blended and prepared for the market. This is done by adding wine spirit, or a sweet wine, when the Oloroso or Amoroso type is preferred, and especially by adding other sherries that have stood in barrels for years. The best sherries are blended by using the Cellar method. This simply involves, at the risk of undermining the mystique associated with making a good sherry, a shelf of sherry barrels arranged according to age. A good modern sherry is a blended wine in which the different older sherries are properly mixed. Assume thus that the sherry farmer started with a barrel of wine from 1920 and kept a supply of that, and each subsequent year's produce up to 1940. The sherry of 1941 would then contain some of each year's wine, and it would thus obviously make no sense to speak of the sherry as a vintage wine. The sherry of a particular year could still dominate, though, in spite of careful blending by the Cellar expert. Sherry is a wine that can be exposed to the air without going flat. Indeed, it is preferable to uncork a bottle of sherry a few hours before drinking. It should be enjoyed without warming or cooling. Normal room temperature is sufficient to allow the oily taste to come fully into its own. The unfalsified fino, almost colorless, aromatic, bone-dry, and bitter without any trace of brackishness, you will not find for sale. Only the KWV has it, for those who are able to coax it from them. The article for sale is somewhat stronger, fortified, sweetened wine, of which every winemaker has its own brand. I dare not name my own favorite here, and it is really not necessary to do so, for everyone should simply follow his own taste, or rely on a reputable wine merchant to make a recommendation. The excellence of sherry is due to the quality of its various components, the most important of which are the oils, fatty acids, and amino acids, and the least important of which is the alcohol content. It is a wine that should be sipped slowly and emphatically, preferably on its own. As a table wine, I recommend it just before the meal, possibly with a soup, unless the taste of the soup is too floury, so not with a puree, and possibly even with a fish like a donkel, barracuda, or halfkoort, that is yellowtail. It really does not go with anything sugary, and it is far too proud of its own flavor to keep the inferior company of fruit and walnuts. Its own nuttiness and its own fruity oils are sufficient, thank you very much. Therefore, enjoy it as a pimpeltjie before the meal, preferably not the sweet variety, or as a drink on its own, for which the oloroso, darker, or semi-sweet varieties are best. Try it at about 11 in the morning, especially on a beautiful sunny day when the vygies are blossoming and the sheaves of wheat are being brought in from the lands.